Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Real excited here, huh? It's been a couple of days to get back with you guys here and to start working on a new topic here. So, this is review number 6. We're going to be covering quite a few things here that all kind of come together, I think, under the title of cognition. But we will be looking at memory, moving then into language, then formally to the thinking piece of cognition, and eventually onto intelligence and the various parts of intelligence. So to start, be a good place to talk about just about memory as a whole. What is memory? Again, we want to always make sure that we're putting the forest before the trees here. So memory is, we receive this info and this raw data, and translating that into a usable form, then being able to store that information, that usable form of information, and retrieve it when necessary. So most memory models are going to have three parts to it: the encoding of the information, the storage of the information, and the retrieval of that information when need be. So to start with encoding, we got to get this info into memory to start out with. If we don't, we automatically lose it. This is the major premise of encoding. Two types of encoding. First, automatic encoding. Okay, automatic encoding, the memory automatically moves itself into storage. We don't have to actually think about it. Kind of like what we ate for breakfast, and some of that stuff will eventually become automatic encoding that might actually at first take a little practice and be more effortful in nature. So the second form of encoding there is effortful encoding. It requires attention, like you're doing right now with your schoolwork. It takes you being able to really consciously think about something before it's moved over to storage and can be accessed whenever you need it to be. And then we talk about, you know, the level of processing and the level of processing theory that's there. And you have shallow and deep processing. And with shallow processing, there is more emphasis on just scratching the surface with the term, whereas deep processing, you're going to go further into that information. And, deep processing and the information and the levels of processing model is going to say the better you know the information, okay, the more in depth you go with its meaning and its semantics, the more likely you'll be able to store it and then retrieve it later on. And if you remember in class, we did that simulation where we simply had people remember the syllables of words and other people be able to rate the usefulness of an object based off of how effective it would be if you were on a deserted island by yourself. And those people who thought about it more deeply and thought about, hey, would this be something that I could utilize on that desert island, remembered more terms than the people who are simply doing it syllables, which is surface level or shallow processing. Remember here with imagery, very important, okay? Attaching images to information makes it easier. Again, makes it easier for you to remember that information. So, for example, if you can, you picture a shoe, but you picture the laces as like strings of spaghetti, something very vivid, something very different in picture form, you might be more able to remember, for example, that shoe in particular. We also have what's called self-referent encoding. We better remember what we're interested in. Um, for example, I always say, although in the age of cell phones, not as important, you're going to remember someone's cell phone who you find to be more attractive. If someone gives their number and you want to call them later on to go on a date, for example, that information you will remember better. And that's why a lot of times people say, well, I do better in this class because I'm interested in it. And a lot of times if the class is reduced to, memorizing information, yeah, that's going to be true. And it's true because of self-referent encoding. You'll see underneath that dual encoding. It's combining different memory aids or different encoding aids together as one. And there's a bunch here that come together. So the first is chunking or breaking down larger parts of information into smaller ones, like phone numbers, for example. You have the first 3 digits in the area code, then 3 digits, then 4 digits. And if you know, say a phone number to someone, you've been trained over time that you see there's an automatic pause there that you do. That's because of chunking. It's easy to remember that way rather than in a 10-digit format where you go straight run through. Although now with technology, much different. And you know, it's not as important, but it's a good one to go with. And then we know we can do things like mnemonics to help us with shortcuts, right? To remember information. So we have acronyms, things like PEMDAS, when you're talking about order of operation, for example. Things like when you did personality and the big five trait theory, ocean, right? When you start talking um, about openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, etc. And then you can also use a method of loci. That's where you use locations to be able to remember a list of items in order. Method of loci, we saw that the memory specialists, when we watched the videos, did this, right? There are people who pictured certain things in certain places, and as they were walking through, it enabled them to remember a whole series of events or objects, etc. We also have context-dependent memory. Okay, context-dependent memory is going to be where you learn the info. You best remember the info where you learned it. Again, sorry for a little stumble there. Where you learn the info, okay, is where you're best going to be remembering that info. And we talk about the scuba diving experiment, the people who learned words underwater while scuba diving and then were tested, remember those words better underwater where they learned them than on the shore above the water, okay? And then state-dependent memory becomes important as well. The physical state you were in when you're learning should be what you are going to then when you display the information. So a lot of people say your study environment should be very similar to your testing environment. For that reason, okay, you're in that same kind of state, and you know your emotional well-being should be the same when you study. That's the same as when you take the test, and for that reason, you would tend to remember things better. We see storage there. Storage is retaining info over time, maintaining that info. And when we talk about the information processing model, we're looking at it right here, those three parts that become a part of it, your sensory memory, your short-term memory, and your long-term memory, okay? All three have the same things, right? All three, they still have storage involved in them, they still have encoding, and they still have the retrieval of information, but the information processing model very specifically has sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory, right over here, is going to be the memory right after that sensory input is brought to you. Okay, so it stores all your incoming stimuli that you receive. And the key here with your sensory memory is if you do not immediately pay attention to the information, that raw data that is being sent to you, you're never going to recover that information later on. So you get one go and that's it. And your sensory memory is broken into two parts, okay? Your iconic memory, that which you see with your eyes, and that's your visual memory, and it lasts about 0.3 seconds. So something's boom, and if you don't notice it, you don't see it, okay, and pay attention to it, that unattended information is gonna be lost forever. And then you'll notice there you have your echoic memory, right? Like echo, 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 your ear here. Your echoic memory is going to be your sensory memory that deals with sound. That lasts for 2 to 3 seconds. It lasts longer than your iconic memory. If you can remember, we talked about that. You need your echoic memory to be longer because if you're holding a conversation with someone, you have to remember what they said at the beginning of the sentence and the end of the sentence to, you know, put forward a coherent response to what they're asking you. It then passes, if you've paid attention and hold on to that information in the information processing model, it then moves over to short-term memory. This information can last about 30 seconds, and you got to do something with that information, rehearse it in some shape or form, or that information is too lost forever. Your short-term memory, we know it has a capacity to it, right? George Miller talked about the idea that with his test that you can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information to hold in your short-term memory at once. And we know we we did that test in class, right? Where we gave people a series of numbers to remember, and they had to be able to then replicate what I said. Most people were lost somewhere between 5 and 9 digits, and that's 7 plus or minus 2. Okay, most people could not move forward. And remember what I've said, I've done that test for 10 years in psychology, and I've had one person surpass 10 digits. George Miller really illustrated that pretty well, and for me that's like one of the easiest things to simulate with you guys, to show the empirical evidence that goes along with it. Now, if you rehearse that information, so you keep repeating that information, you will notice, through maintenance rehearsal. So you keep repeating it again and again and again, although not completely efficient. We'll talk about more efficient models to remember memory. That will take information to your long-term memory. Some information there, yeah, it may be lost over time, but theoretically, the limits of your long-term memory are infinite. Different than your short-term memory that has a capacity, different than your sensory memory that has a capacity. Remember your sensory memory, iconic, it's about time, 0.3 seconds for something that's visual, echoic 2 to 3 seconds for something that's auditory. Your short-term memory for about 30 seconds, plus a capacity on the amount of information, 7 plus or minus 2, discovered by George Miller. Long-term memory, though, has an infinite capacity overall. So theoretically, it lasts a lifetime. And the AP exam, I'm going to move myself here on the screen. The AP exam really loves to have you kind of differentiate between the types of long-term memories. So as we go through this, listen, your explicit or declarative memories, they're conscious. There's something you have to declare. You think about when you're looking at that information. So that's broken down. Your explicit memory is your conscious recollection, broken into 2 parts. Your episodic memory are your events. It's sort of like your autobiographical memory. Maybe you remember those wonderful events of your 5th birthday when you have a ninja turtle come to your house, right? And all your little friends were there and they thought you were the coolest guy ever, the coolest cat around. Your semantic memory, that's your factually based information that you continue to acquire over the course of your lifetime. Your semantic memory, you can keep adding to it, right? That Jeopardy-like information. Okay, be careful as we move on. We talk about semantics and language in terms of meaning. Here we're talking about fact-based knowledge. As we move over, your implicit memories are non-declarative, right? You don't actively declare. They're your unconscious memories, can be broken into several parts here. The first is classical conditioning. So if you were bitten by a dog when you were younger and now you're conditioned, oh my God, anytime I see a dog, my heart really starts beating real fast. I start to perspirate, okay? You don't think about that. It just happens. You don't bring your memory back to that event consciously, but unconsciously it does take place because you're conditioned to do so. The other part of this is your procedural memory, your skills that are going to be there, like brushing your teeth, tying your shoes. I know we've talked about this in class. You guys are 18 years old. No one is sitting there going, as they tie their shoes, whoop, swoop, pull. You're just doing it without thinking about it. And that's an implicit, non-declarative, procedural type memory. We're going to jump memory organization just for a second to get to memory storage because it goes right along with this chart. So you can see here on your paper here, okay, in memory storage, it's important to understand that most of our memories, okay, these ones over here, are going to take place in the hippocampus. The AP exam loves this concept. For some reason, students struggle with this concept. And remember, ACH neurons in the hippocampus are what helps with memory. So that's where most of our memories are formed. However, okay, our procedural memories are going to take place in the cerebellum. And that makes perfect sense. When we go back to biological basis of behavior, the cerebellum, our balance, our coordination, necessary for those procedural type tasks that we do on a daily basis that we don't think about, okay? The cerebellum will be responsible for those. That is so important as we work through this. Going back to our memory organization, we work in terms of a hierarchy. So memory is stored according to that hierarchy, and we form what are called semantic networks. They're pre-existing mental pictures, basically, of how something should look. A restaurant, a classroom, a bedroom, whatever the case may be. So we work according to semantic networks. We can't rethink everything every time, so we pull on our experiences, say, hey, this is basically what the model looks like, okay? In most cases, this is like the prototype, and we'll see that as we move forward into the thinking aspect of this. And then you'll see their schemas, right? A pre-existing mental concept of how something should look, right? So our semantic network, we kind of link these all together. That's where we get network from. Our schemas themselves are pre-existing mental networks of how things should look over time. Sorry if I said that wrong as we go through. One major term the AP really loves, long-term potentiation. And all we're saying here is this is the neural basis of all memory. Okay, connections are strengthened over the course of time. So if you repeat the same action or the same info again and again and again, and those same neurons keep firing, okay, with repeated stimulation in the same pattern, it will eventually strengthen that connection between neurons over time, and it will make the behavior, the concept, the memory that much stronger, okay? A lot of people, our athletes out there might say, hey, that's like muscle memory. Yes, okay? Moving to our retrieval portion of things here, okay? So taking information from our long-term memory and moving it back to our short-term memory so we can actively deal with that information, okay? So retrieval for our purposes, taking information out of storage, right? Bringing it right there in front of us so that we can use that information. And I always say that would be like, okay, I've saved a Word document on the computer, I can close it up, but then I need to access it again because I need to either reference it or I need to make corrections to it, whatever the case may be. Boom, that information is there for you, okay? And we know there's certain stipulations when it comes to retrieving information, okay? There's certain things, for example, we have the serial positioning effect where, listen, the order of a list is going to matter. We tend to remember things at the beginning of the list, the primacy effect. We tend to remember things at the end of the list, the recency effect. And we kind of forget those things that are positioned in the middle. You know, you look at the Star Spangled Banner, for example, very easy to start from the beginning. I'm sure you remember the last line, but if you got to pick that up from the middle, very difficult to do so. We also know that what you're being asked to do with the information is going to be really important. For example, the FRQ portion of the AP exam is a recall exercise where you have to retrieve the information off the top of your head. There's no cue there for you to be able to do that. So it becomes very difficult on the traditional AP exam. Now, recognition is you have cues there. That might be something like a multiple choice test. That might be something like a matching test. That might be fill in if there's a word bank, okay? You're able to kind of jog or prime your memory along the way. Easy to remember our flashbulb memories. Those are those very vivid memories. You can come back to that day and you can remember every detail of it. We talk about 9/11, September 11, 2001 being one of those dates. For a lot of people, that's a flashbulb memory. Perhaps their wedding is a hugely important event that they remember every aspect of. You better remember every aspect of that, gentlemen, or you're in a lot of trouble later on. And then there's other times that, memories aren't as vivid to us. A lot of times there's what we call repressed memories, that sometimes we unconsciously bury these memories. They're not reliable, sometimes too painful, so they're repressed. And for that reason, that information is there. It's just difficult for us to dig up that information and retrieve it within that moment. We also deal with encoding failure. Um, you know, Guess what? Sometimes we forget information because we never really encoded it or took it in the first place. And we did that penny exercise in class where I put 4 examples of the penny on the board and I asked people, hey, which is the real one? I mean, we've handled pennies quite frequently within our lives, and you would think that that information would be in our long-term memory. But if we never actually dedicated it there in the first time and took the time to pay attention to note what the actual features of that penny were, you might not remember it, and that's called encoding failure. Then we have what's called the encoding specificity principle. So the more closely, okay, retrieval cues match the way we first learn the information, okay, the better we remember it. It's very similar to state-dependent memory, okay? So I'm going to say that one more time here. The more closely retrieval cues match the way we learn the information, okay, the more likely we are to remember it. So, if I have someone taking a test and, oh my God, they're a global student, like, oh, I don't remember the causes of the French Revolution. And in class, we have meals, meals, meals. And my retrieval cue matches that. I say, oh boy, I'm hungry. I missed breakfast, which wasn't like, oh my God, meals, right? That will give us the opportunity to remember the information. We also talk about the forgetting curve, really important. Ebbinghaus is the individual who came up with this, Ebbinghaus. Everybody knows I'm a horrible speller. I'm very impressed with myself right there. So recall reduces rapidly at first, and then it reaches a plateau eventually, where we're not going to forget the same amount of information. And what it really, really does is it gives justification for the spacing effect. That, listen, you don't want to study everything at once. You want to go back to it on numerous occasions, because each time you go back to that information, you're less likely to forget. Okay, that's called the forgetting curve by Ebbinghaus. You'll see here proactive interference. Okay, that is when old information blocks new information. Okay, so you just learned about World War I, you move on to World War II, and all you can think about during that time with the causes is meals. You're like, oh my God, all I can think about is World War I. Why can't I remember new information? Why can't I remember that appeasement is the cause of World War II? Then you have what's called retroactive interference. New information is going to block old information. So all of a sudden now you get to that global history test on the world wars with Mr. Brennan. You just learned World War II, and it says, what were the causes of World War I? And you're like, I can't remember that information, right? All I remember is appeasement. All I remember is, Hitler at the Munich conference with Neville Chamberlain. Why can't I remember mania? Why can't I remember the causes of World War I? That is retroactive interference. The misinformation effect, so important, so important. Elizabeth Office, her research here, it's the distortion of memory by suggestion or misinformation. Again, it's the distortion of memory by suggestion or misinformation. That misinformation effect. Remember, I had people watch that car crash YouTube video in class. In one half of the class, I asked how fast were the cars going when they hit. The other people in the class, I asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed together. Side with smashed had a way higher average mile per hour estimate. Why? Because of that misinformation effect that's there, that false memory that comes. Loftus talks about. It's why, and people's minds, they start to develop memories on their own. That's why at the scene of a crime, they try to keep witnesses separate. They don't want one person's memories interfering with another person's memories of the events. Now, and let me get to the amnesia ones here, okay, which is our forgetting. So retrograde amnesia. So you forget the old info, okay? Retrograde amnesia, you forget past events. And you can remember in class we watched Me in the Vow with Rachel McAdams. Oh, that wasn't me, was it? No. Okay. So you watched Channing Tatum with Rachel McAdams in The Vow. She didn't remember her past life with him. She only remembered things moving forward. Okay. And then we go to retrograde amnesia, right? Oh, I'm sorry. I said that wrong in this. My fault. So let's go back. Anterograde amnesia is amnesia that moves forward. So we forget our new info. I might have said it right. I don't know. I just want to make sure it's right at this point. So we forget our new info. That would be like the movie 50 First Dates, right? With Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore. She goes to sleep, comes back the next day. She can't remember what just happened that day. She has all the recollection from the past. Retrograde amnesia. Amnesia moves backwards. You forget the old info. Now that I look at the graph again, I'm pretty sure I got that right. But hey, I just want to make sure that information is there for you. We are going to move forward, okay? We're going to move into language now. Language being, we talked about it. Language can have multiple facets to it. It can be spoken language. It can be body language. But here we're really going to focus on spoken language for the most part. So let's get at the basics here, okay? We can see here, your phonemes is the smallest unit of sound. So if we take the word chat, for example, the ch, that's a phoneme. It doesn't have meaning on its own, but is a smallest basic unit, of sound, smallest basic unit of a word. As you move along, morphemes, they mean more, okay? They mean more. Morphemes, very like a prefix, like pre, for example, meaning before. Really important to have that. And generally a syllable. We talk about grammar. Grammar is our rules to our language, okay? They are rules to a language that enable us to communicate. And it can be broken into two parts here. It can be broken into our semantics and our syntax. Our semantics are a set of rules by which we derive meaning, right? A set of rules from which we derive meaning. So we know if we see a verb and it has ed at the end of it, for example, we know that that person is referencing the past tense, right? And then we have our syntax, our rules for the order of our words when we combine them to create sentences. And we know that in English, different than Spanish, in English, the adjective becomes before the noun. So like white house. Whereas in Spanish, adjective comes after noun. Casa Blanca, different. And it's these rules that allow us to communicate with each other effectively. When we talk about, going to move myself again, okay? I don't actually know where to move myself. There we go. When we talk about the kind of stages of language as we develop in it, the babbling stage is the first stage here. It's infants, the first time they're speaking, they make sounds. It could be a ba, 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 ba. It can be ma, 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 ma. Or da, 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 da. They don't count as actual words. They don't hold any meaning to them. But it's going to be a very important part of language development, not only for the motor functioning around the mouth, but moving forward as you start to progress into full words. We have the one word stage. Well, it's their first singular words that kids start to speak, okay? Something like food. I mean, it's a complex word, so maybe it's toy. Toy, 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 toy. And every toy is exactly the same. It's just referenced as toy. Two-word stage, okay, 2 words there. They're like that, those mini sentences, like, my son used to eat now, eat now, eat now. Not I don't want to eat now, or I want to eat now, but eat now, because that's what he was able to put together. Wasn't able to follow all the semantics and the syntax of language. Next stage there, is your early multi-word stage. Some people call that your telegraphic language, because you speak almost like it's coming from a telegraph. Um, Go car now, is what Connor always says. Go car now. He wants to go for a car ride, but it doesn't understand how to alter verb tenses, how to kind of put a whole sentence together. And eventually we get to the full sentence stage, where the meaning of the word is right, so our semantics are good as we go through, and the syntax is right, and we're putting together we're putting together nouns and verbs correctly. The theories of language development, this is actually one of my favorite parts. I know you guys don't care as much about it, but we're going to look there. Imitation. Kids repeat what they hear, and that's the bottom line. And we can remember me talking in class about how, my dad used to describe his boss in a particular way, not so appropriate. That boss called, picked up the phone, and I said the same thing. That's the imitation aspect of things. And when we talk about it, we talk about operant conditioning. So there you see our Skinners. Those are behavioralists, right? We learn language through stimulus response and reinforcement, kind of. Reinforce for language use. Guys, the problem with it is experts in language are going to say, okay, so you're telling me that somebody who is going to learn 60,000 words by the time they hit high school, okay, that every one of those is going to be like, oh yeah, good boy, use that, or oh, bad boy, don't use that word. They say that's impractical. It would just take too long. Our vocabulary wouldn't be able to build up that quickly. That there has to be something more innate about it. And that's where you get Noam Chomsky from. These are what we call our innatists. And Noam Chomsky talked about our inborn universal grammar, right? Or our language acquisition device. And that it was kind of innate. And that's what separated humans from other beings. We're predisposed to learn it. For some reason, humans just have this biological ability to recognize language, start to remember it, and utilize it themselves. And also talked about a critical period, a period of time where something must be learned or you're not going to learn it. And for children, language is one of those things. When you hit a certain age, it becomes very, very difficult to then learn a language. And we know that when we even look at second languages, that people who start a second language much younger, the results are much more rapid when they're trying to learn that language. Lastly, linguistic determinism. Okay, that was developed by a psychologist, the last name of Worf, Benjamin Worf. And what he came up with and talked about was that language influences the way we think. Okay, and right away went with the Hopi Indians who didn't have a past tense, and they were studied in great detail. And I said, wow, these people really don't dwell on the past. Why is that? Well, if you can't express the past tense, how are you going to then dwell on the past tense? Okay, moving our way over to thinking here. Thinking obviously rolls under cognitive psychology, just like the rest of these. One of the major pillars, I guess you would say, of psychology. So let's start at this right from the start here. When we talk about concepts, right? Or, hey, almost forgot, don't lose the forest amongst the trees. So we talk about thinking, we're talking about processing information, we're talking about organizing that information, understanding that information, communicating that information. So there's multiple facets when we start to talk about, what is thinking, when we talk about cognition. So to start, we have what are called concepts, right? These are mental categories that we use to group objects, events, characteristics. And we have what are called schema, okay, that go right along with that. But our prototypes, sorry about that, are our most perfect example, the example that comes to mind, the example that we think about, the best example of a concept is our prototype. So what's the best example of a vehicle? We think of a car, right? We give the example in class where if all of a sudden someone was asking a date and they say, yeah, I'll pick you up in my vehicle, and they show up with a tricycle, and you're like, dude, that's weird. Okay, that's because it doesn't match our prototype or the best available example that's there. Moving along, when we talk about, okay, we're going to problem solve, a way to do it is algorithms. It's a step-by-step strategy that guarantees you the correct solution. But we know that's not the way the mind always works. We can't always work in algorithms, okay? It's just not efficient, and it's not a great way of preservation for us. So algorithms, just like a computer would work based off of code, every possible solution is thought about, and then we get the correct one. Remember in class I talked about if you were robbing a house and you went to the safe and you were using an algorithm to open that safe, and you start with 0, 0, 0, 0. It doesn't work? 0, 0, 0, 1. And you go from there. Not always efficient, but you are eventually guaranteed to get the right answer. Heuristics are those rule of thumb situations, right? The shortcut strategies that we use every day of our life, but they are error prone, right? They're not always going to guarantee you the correct answer as we go through it. There are 2 types of heuristics. I know the chart here only has 1, but on your sheet 2, we'll cover it. The first is representative heuristics. This is where you make, right? You make inferences or judgments based upon your experience. So for example, if you're going with representative heuristics, you see someone that's, wearing glasses, they're very quiet. When you walk into the library, they're sitting down, they have a stack of books in front of them. Oh, well, that must be the librarian there. And you make that because that is the best possible prototype of a concept that you know. That's what representative heuristics do. It represents the best possible prototype of a particular concept. And then you have availability heuristics, right? That's a mental shortcut that you take. That's going to rely on the frequency at which you see something or the recency in which you see something. So, after 9/11, we talked about how people stopped flying. Now, if you look at it, okay, even after 9/11, it was still much, much safer by terms of overall statistics to fly somewhere than it is to drive somewhere. But that memory was the last available memory, the one that was recently in our head, the one that was, with obvious just cause, played again and again and again. And for that reason, a lot of people decided, hey, I'm not flying. You'll see there functional fixedness, right? It's when you can't think outside the box. You can only think of the intended usage of something. So if I put up a roll of toilet paper, you're like, hey, that's for wiping my booty. Okay, and you can't think of anything else. You're kind of boxed in by that. But then we did we had you come up with 30 different ways that you could use that toilet paper or the cardboard roll itself. That's, functional fixedness. That's overcoming functional fixedness, where you see beyond just the intended use of something overall. Belief bias is the tendency to believe that pre-existing beliefs, okay, are going to are the right beliefs. So again, your belief bias is a tendency of one's pre-existing beliefs to distort logical reasoning by making invalid conclusions. So I held these beliefs before, and I'm going to stand by these beliefs. So you can see on your list, the next one there, belief perseverance. It's a tendency to cling to our beliefs in the face of contrary evidence. Okay, the tendency to cling onto beliefs in the face of contrary evidence. So you could be provided, or whoever, with this whole list of evidence that's there, empirical evidence, done with valid studies that are incredibly accurate. And you say, no, I don't buy it. I'm going to hold on to the belief that I have based upon my own experiences. That hindsight bias that we see there, I did not write it down as a term for you to know, but that I knew it all along thing, that like Monday quarterback type of idea. Hindsight is 20/20, right? That after the fact, like, course, I knew that all along. And then, of course, I also didn't write it down. Confirmation bias, where you're kind of looking for any evidence that's going to back up your point of view. And that's the evidence you're searching for. And for that reason, you ignore evidence that might be to the contrary. We have inductive, let me move myself again, and deductive reasoning on the list. Inductive reasoning is going to be data-based decisions, right? Data-driven decisions. And inductive, we go from general to specific. So we come up with a theory first, and then we look at the individual pieces, okay? When that's more of a top-down processing type thing too, when we go back to perception. Deductive reasoning, it's driven by logic. You look at the specific information first, and then you broaden yourself out to the general information. Okay, that's going to be more of a bottom-up processing type of method if we would take it back to perception. Sorry, allergy season is brutal. And you'll see on your list divergent thinking. That's your ability to think about many different things at once, to come up with many different solutions to a problem. Whereas convergent thinking, right, we're narrowing ourselves down to one particular solution. Almost here, kids. Last topic here that we're going to cover today. On your sheet, let me just have my sheet out too, so I know the order in which I'm going to ramble here, all this information off the top of my head. So when we talk about intelligence, what we're talking about is, how do we acquire knowledge? Are we learning from our experiences? Are we solving problems? Are we adapting to what we call new or novel situations? So big overarching emphasis here. And you can see the visual provides you with that. So the first kind of view of intelligence here, I don't know if the AP would really go to this, but a guy by the last name of Galton came up with the idea. He was the first to suggest that intelligence was inherited. And we know that heredity does have some impact on it, but he talked about eugenics, where, you breed smart people together to produce smart people, and talked about intelligence being based off of, the size of the head, etc. A lot of what he came up with doesn't hold up. Yes, intelligence does have a facet of it that is based off of heredity, but of course is not the whole thing, nor is it a guarantee. Second guy here, Cattell, he came up with the two clusters of mental ability: crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence was, your reasoning skills, your verbal skills, your accumulation of knowledge over the course of time, your fact-based knowledge, that you continually build over time. So even as you get older, your crystallized intelligence can continue to grow. You stack that info. If you've ever watched Jeopardy with your grandparents and are mesmerized, listen, that's what crystallized intelligence accumulating over the course of years and years and years will get you. Your fluid intelligence, I know I used reasoning with crystallized intelligence, but I'm talking about more of a school type sense. With your fluid intelligence here, we're talking about your spatial abilities, things that come natural to you, things that aren't rote memory, for example, okay? And, how to adapt to new technologies, etc. That's going to decrease over time. So, if you're trying to explain to your parents new technologies and they just don't get it and you're growing frustrated, one of the things that goes along with that is fluid intelligence starts to diminish over the course of time. So, being able to adapt and problem solve over time is going to go down. And when we get to developmental psychology, we'll talk about as people enter their 70s and 80s, fluid intelligence really starts to take a nosedive. When we talk about Spearman's G factor here, right? Generalized intelligence, it saying if you're smart in one area, you're probably smart in multiple areas. And that's what Spearman came up with. He called it his G factor, or generalized intelligence. And a lot of people are like, this isn't specific enough. Yeah, if you're good in one area, you might be good in another, but it doesn't give us a detailed enough explanation or enough of a dynamic definition of intelligence. So from there, Howard Gardner came about, right? Because everything in psychology is that pendulum swinging in a reaction to criticisms on the other end of things. So Gardner came up with 8 intelligences, which are showcased here, working on a 9th intelligence being added to it. And Gardner he taught that 9th intelligence was the existential one, or starting to understand death, the dead, etc. Multiple intelligence said that, hey, listen, people can articulate their knowledge in a lot of ways, and there are ways which people best express their intelligence, and they can do it in each of these various ways. And that is really Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence is what a lot of schools are based off of today, giving kids the opportunity to express their knowledge, express their intelligence in a variety of different ways. Then we move it down. So we go from Spearman and Gardner, and we go to Sternberg and his triartic model, his 3 pieces of intelligence, right? Start with analytical. This is what IQ tests. This is your book smarts, okay? Working to come up with a single answer. Your practical intelligence is your ability to, size up new situations and adapt to real life situations, aka your street smarts. And then lastly, your creative intelligence, right? This leads to you producing new and novel ideas. A lot of times these people are what we call divergent thinkers, looking out and expanding the horizon outwards rather than just in at a single solution. Oh, the old IQ chart and distribution. This is the end, guys. So don't get too worried here. When we talk about Alfred Binet, along with Terman, he'll develop the Stanford-Binet IQ test, right? The first intelligence test. It gives a number to that intelligence for the first time. Your mental age over your chronological age times 100. So your chronological age is your actual age, where your mental age is your tested age compared to other people, right? Again, compared because it's standardized to other people your age. 100, and you can see it here on the bottom, we've done this in class before, is the average intelligence. Before we get into the various elements, there's just a couple of other things. The Wechsler test, the WAIS test, or the WIS test for children. These are most commonly used today for intelligence testing. And then the Flynn effect, when we start talking about IQ scores, the Flynn effect is going to say, hey, IQ or average IQ has steadily been on the increase for the last 80 or so years. Why? Is it because people are actually getting smarter, or are people becoming better test takers? Okay, so when we talk about extremes of intelligence, anything over about 130 to 135, so when we move 2 standard deviations out, is going to be considered high intelligence. So 130, you start to hit that gifted area. Above 145, you're starting to work on that genius area. Okay, again, standard deviation is 15 in terms of intelligence. So 1 standard deviation is considered normal. So this is right. This is where 68% of the population lives, somewhere between 85 and 115. 1 standard deviation on either side of the norm, okay, which is 100. We talk about low intelligence. 70 is considered just about borderline mentally retarded because you're moving now 2 standard deviations. When you start moving about 2 standard deviations out, okay, that's when you're on the low side down here of intelligence. So below 70, we're starting to work our way into mental retardation, okay? Now, so 68% of the population lives here. 95% or so of the population lives within 2 standard deviations, which is considered norm for intelligence, somewhere between 70 and 130. And that is a big range, just so we are aware. In terms of influence on IQ, as we were saying, Galton, who went all in on heredity, is not correct. But genetics does, of course, play a factor in intelligence. Heredity does play a factor in it. But environment also plays a factor, particularly when we talk about those critical ages. If kids miss those critical ages, their skills are going to be much lower. Their IQ is going to be much lower, whereas they get good schooling and they have all those skills worked on when they're younger, their IQ tends to be higher. So we know that environment and genetics both play a factor. In terms of types of tests, our aptitude tests test our ability to learn new skills, whereas our achievement tests, like the SAT, test what we know. Now, in terms of test creation, what we see here, guys, with this normal curve, that's because the IQ test is now a standardized test. That's where we administer the test to a representative sample, okay, of future test takers, and you establish a meaningful means of comparison, okay, or a meaningful basis for comparison between people. You're going to test it out first amongst a representative sample. Standardization, the AP loves. I know it and I know it well. So you administer a test to a representative sample of future test takers to establish a basis for later comparison between people who take the test. When you do that, okay, the test should be reliable. That means you should get the same results every single time. But at the same time, okay, you want the test to be valid. But in terms of reliability, there's 2 terms I want to go over quick with you. The first being split half reliability, okay, where you compare the 2 halves of the test. Are they consistent amongst the individuals, or is one part of the test, like the first one, way harder than the second part? We don't want that. And test retest reliability. So guess what? I take the test twice. Is my score the same or near the same both times? Okay. Then we talk about we want the test to be valid also. Okay. Valid means, sorry guys, the test is accurate. It measures what it's supposed to measure, what it's intended to measure. You want content validity in your test. So the test measures what you want it to. If it's an IQ test, it better measure IQ. And you also want predictability, validity. So a test is able to, if it's supposed to accurately predict down the road, that it actually accurately predicts a trait and what it means down the road for an individual, maybe in a place of employment or whatever the case may be. So standardized tests, going back, right, they're going to create a normal distribution or a normal curve. 68% of the people live within 1 standard deviation. And yes, standard deviation is used to compare scores. And it shows how much scores are going to vary from the mean. And we're not going to get that much into that right now, because when we do research methods right before the end of the test, we'll get into that. I'm sure you've had enough of Brennan for today, my little Brennanites. Sleep tight. We'll see you again in a couple of days. See you later, guys. Take care.